Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the most unexpected consequences. That's what Frank Miller learned when he offered his old barn to a shivering veteran on the coldest night of winter, going against his community's warnings about outsiders. Now, as 50 uniformed soldiers lined his long gravel driveway at dawn, Frank realized his simple act of compassion had set something extraordinary in motion, something that would change his struggling farm and life forever. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness have the most unexpected consequences. That's what Frank Miller learned when he offered his old barn to a shivering veteran on the coldest night of winter, going against his community's warnings about outsiders. Now, as 50 uniformed soldiers lined his long gravel driveway at dawn, Frank realized his simple act of compassion had set something extraordinary in motion, something that would change his struggling farm and life forever. Hi everyone, welcome to Inspiring Stories. Today, I want to share something special with you that reminds us how a single decision can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. Frank Miller woke before sunrise, just as he had every day for the past 35 years. At 58, his body had memorized the rhythm of farm life, rising with the roosters, working until his muscles ached, falling asleep to the chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. He pulled on his worn flannel shirt and the same pair of Carhartt overalls he'd had for a decade, patched at the knees more times than he could count. The kitchen of his farmhouse was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the antique wall clock that had belonged to his grandfather. Frank started the coffee pot and looked out the window at his 80 acres in Riverdale County. The first hints of dawn revealed frost-covered fields and the silhouette of the old red barn that needed a fresh coat of paint. Another day, he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the cold kitchen. The furnace had given out 3 days ago, and Frank hadn't been able to afford the repairs yet. The last 5 years had been brutal for small farmers like him. The drought 2 summers ago, followed by early frosts, had decimated his corn crop. The bank was making noises about the mortgage payments he'd fallen behind on. His son Michael had joined the army instead of taking over the farm, and his wife Clara had passed away from cancer 3 years ago, leaving Frank alone with his memories. And mounting debts. He poured his coffee into a chipped mug and stepped onto the porch to check the temperature. The thermometer read 12 degrees, the coldest night of the winter so far. As Frank surveyed his property in the growing light, something caught his eye near the barn. A figure was huddled against the wall, partially sheltered by the overhang. Frank set his coffee down and walked across the frozen yard. As he got closer, he could make out a man in a tattered military jacket, his face half hidden by a grey beard streaked with frost. A small backpack lay beside him, and he appeared to be sleeping, though the temperature made Frank worry it might be something worse. "Hey there," Frank called softly, not wanting to startle the man. The stranger's eyes snapped open, alert, wary, assessing Frank in an instant. Military, Frank thought immediately, recognizing the vigilance his own son had developed after his first deployment. "Sorry to trespass," the man said, his voice hoarse as he struggled to stand. "I was just trying to get out of the wind for a few hours. I'll be on my way." Frank noticed a slight limp as the man reached for his backpack. His face was weathered, maybe mid-60s, with deep lines around eyes that had seen too much. The patch on his faded jacket read, "Williams." "Where you headed?" Frank asked. "West," the man said simply. "Heard there might be work in Granite City." Frank nodded, knowing Granite City was still 30 miles away, a long walk in this weather. "You serve?" "Yes, sir. 24 years. Marine Corps." The man straightened slightly, a habit that seemed ingrained despite his current circumstances. Frank thought about his son Michael, somewhere overseas on his 3rd tour. He thought about how he'd want someone to help Michael if he were ever in need. "Got a pot of coffee inside," Frank said, gesturing toward the house. "And the barn's a lot warmer than sitting out here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. The veteran hesitated, pride battling with practical need in his eyes. "Name's James Williams," he finally said, extending a weathered hand. "Most people just call me Jim." "Frank Miller," Frank replied, shaking Jim's hand firmly. The strength in the older man's grip surprised him despite the cold. "Come on in before we both freeze solid out here." Frank led Jim up the worn path to the farmhouse. The veteran's limp became more pronounced as they climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Inside, the house wasn't much warmer than outside, but it broke the wind. Frank motioned toward the kitchen table, a solid oak piece he'd built himself 20 years ago. "Furnace is out," Frank explained, pouring a second mug of coffee, "but the stove still works." He turned on a burner for extra heat and placed a cast iron pan on it. "Eggs and bacon okay?" Jim nodded, cupping the mug with both hands. "More than okay. Don't want to impose, though." "Not an imposition when I'm cooking for myself anyway," Frank said, cracking eggs into the pan. He glanced at the wall where photographs hung in mismatched frames. Frank and Clara on their wedding day, Michael in his army uniform, Frank's parents. In front of the barn when it was newly built, Frank set 2 plates on the table, each with eggs, bacon, and toast. As they ate, Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm called. Frank excused himself to answer the old rotary phone mounted on the wall. "Morning, Edith," Frank said, his voice softening slightly for the 76-year-old widow who'd been friends with his mother. "Yes, I'm still planning to fix your fence today. No, the cold won't bother me. Yes, I'll be sure to wear my heavy coat." He hung up and returned to the table. "Neighbor," he explained, "her fence keeps getting knocked down by the wind." "You do repairs for your neighbors?" Jim asked. "Just the small stuff. Edith's husband used to help my dad during harvest. Now she's alone. Community helps each other out here." Frank shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At least that's how it used to be. Frank refilled their coffee mugs. "Weather report says the temperature's dropping to near 0 tonight. Where were you planning to sleep?" Jim stared into his coffee. "There's a truck stop about 12 miles, up the highway. Sometimes they let folks sleep in the lounge if you buy something." Frank looked out the window at his barn. It wasn't fancy, but he'd converted part of the hayloft into a small apartment years ago when they'd hired seasonal help nobody had used. It since his farmhand Tommy left for college 2 years back. "Got a space above the barn," Frank said casually. "Nothing special, but there's a bed, small bathroom. Heat works up there better than it does in here." He caught Jim's surprised look. "Could use some help fixing Edith's fence. Then there's a broken tractor I've been meaning to get to. Might take a couple of days. You can stay there if you want to. Earn some meal money before heading to Granite City." Jim studied Frank's face, looking for the catch. "Don't know many folks these days who'd offer a stranger a place to stay." Frank stood and carried their plates to the sink. "My son's serving. His 3rd tour. Like I said, community helps each other out." He paused, then added quietly, "Or at least we should." The veteran hesitated, pride battling with practical need in his eyes. "Name's James Williams," he finally said, extending a weathered hand. "Most people just call me Jim." "Frank Miller," Frank replied, shaking Jim's hand firmly. The strength in the older man's grip surprised him despite the cold. "Come on in before we both freeze solid out here." Frank led Jim up the worn path to the farmhouse. The veteran's limp became more pronounced as they climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Inside, the house wasn't much warmer than outside, but it broke the wind. Frank motioned toward the kitchen table, a solid oak piece he'd built himself 20 years ago. "Furnace is out," Frank explained, pouring a second mug of coffee, "but the stove still works." He turned on a burner for extra heat and placed a cast iron pan on it. "Eggs and bacon okay?" Jim nodded, cupping the mug with both hands. "More than okay. Don't want to impose, though." Not an imposition when I'm cooking for myself anyway, Frank said, cracking eggs into the pan. He glanced at the wall where photographs hung in mismatched frames. Frank and Clara on their wedding day, Michael in his army uniform, Frank's parents. In front of the barn when it was newly built, Frank set 2 plates on the table, each with eggs, bacon, and toast. As they ate, Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm called. Frank excused himself to answer the old rotary phone mounted on the wall. "Morning, Edith," Frank said, his voice softening slightly for the 76-year-old widow who'd been friends with, his mother. "Yes, I'm still planning to fix your fence today. No, the cold won't bother me. Yes, I'll be sure to wear my heavy coat." He hung up and returned to the table. "Neighbor," he explained, "her fence keeps getting knocked down by the wind." "You do repairs for your neighbors?" Jim asked. "Just the small stuff. Edith's husband used to help my dad during harvest. Now she's alone. Community helps each other out here." Frank shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. At least that's how it used to be. Frank refilled their coffee mugs. "Weather report says the temperature's dropping to near 0 tonight. Where were you planning to sleep?" Jim stared into his coffee. "There's a truck stop about 12 miles. Up the highway. Sometimes they let folks sleep in the lounge if you buy something." Frank looked out the window at his barn. It wasn't fancy, but he'd converted part of the hayloft into a small apartment years ago when they'd hired seasonal help. Nobody had used it since his farmhand Tommy left for college 2 years back. "Got a space above the barn," Frank said casually. "Nothing special, but there's a bed, small bathroom. Heat works up there better than it does in here." He caught Jim's surprised look. "Could use some help fixing Edith's fence. Then there's a broken tractor I've been meaning to get to. Might take a couple of days. You can stay there if you want to. Earn some meal money before heading to Granite City." Jim studied Frank's face, looking for the catch. "Don't know many folks these days who'd offer a stranger a place to stay." Frank stood and carried their plates to the sink. "My son's serving. His 3rd tour. Like I said, community helps each other out." He paused, then added quietly, "Or at least we should." After breakfast, Frank showed Jim to the barn apartment. The space was small but clean. A twin bed with a quilt Clara had made, a bathroom with a shower, and a space heater that kept the worst of the cold at bay. Frank left Jim to settle in, while he gathered his tools for Mrs. Henderson's fence repair. When Frank climbed into his rusted blue pickup truck, he took a moment to check his phone. 3 missed calls from Riverdale Bank. Frank sighed and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat without listening to the voicemails. He already knew what they said. The truck's engine protested in the cold before finally turning over. As Frank drove the half-mile to Mrs. Henderson's property, he passed the "For Sale" sign on the Johnson farm. Terry Johnson had been the 3rd generation to work that land before the bank foreclosed last spring. Now the fields lay fallow, the farmhouse empty, waiting for some corporation to turn it into vacation homes or a factory farm. Frank's own situation wasn't much better. The folder of bills in his desk drawer grew thicker each month. Property taxes were due next week, $3,200 he didn't have. The payment extension he'd negotiated with the bank expired on Friday. Without at least half the mortgage payment, they'd start foreclosure proceedings. Clara's medical bills still totaled over $45,000, despite the payment plan he'd arranged. At Mrs. Henderson's farm, Frank worked on the fence while his mind calculated and recalculated the impossible math of his finances. He'd already sold his father's tractor and most of the livestock. What little savings they'd had went to Clara's treatments in those final months. He'd been hoping to get the winter wheat planted, but the tractor's transmission had failed, and repairs would cost more than the crop would bring in. "You're a godsend, Frank," Mrs. Henderson said, bringing him a thermos of hot tea around noon. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Frank smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Happy to help, Edith. Your Harold did the same for my family plenty of times." "How's Michael doing?" she asked, her face concerned. Any word from him? Got a letter last week. He's safe. That's all I can really ask for. Frank didn't mention the worry that kept him awake at night. The fear that his son might not come home, or might come home, changed beyond recognition. 3 tours was too many. The few video calls they'd managed showed the strain in Michael's eyes. And the farm? Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice softer. Frank hammered a nail with more force than necessary. Getting by, he lied. Mrs. Henderson's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. They both knew what getting by meant these days. I made you a casserole, she said. It's in your truck, should feed you for a couple days. Edith, you don't need to... Nonsense, she interrupted. It's nothing, just something I threw together. Frank knew it wasn't nothing. Mrs. Henderson lived on a fixed income and could barely afford her own groceries, but she'd never let a neighbor go hungry. The community took care of its own. What was left of the community, anyway. When he returned home mid-afternoon, Frank found Jim already at work in the equipment shed, tools spread around the broken tractor. The veteran had clearly identified the transmission problem and was methodically dismantling the access panel. You know tractors? Frank asked, surprised. Jim nodded without looking up from his work. Grew up on a farm in Nebraska. Joined the Marines to see something besides cornfields, but you never really forget how these beasts work. His hands moved. With practiced efficiency despite the cold. Problems the clutch assembly. Might be able to salvage it without a full replacement if you've got the right parts. Frank watched Jim work, a small flame of hope flickering to life. If they could fix the tractor, he might still get a winter crop in. It wouldn't solve everything, but it would buy him time. As the sun began to set, turning the snow-covered fields, Golden Frank checked his mailbox. Among the bills was a notice from the county. He opened it with a sense of dread. Code violation. Notice, unauthorized dwelling use. The letter, signed by Howard Mercer, the head of the town council, informed Frank that a complaint had been filed about unauthorized occupation of an agricultural structure. According to local zoning ordinances, the barn apartment didn't meet residential codes and couldn't legally house anyone. Frank had 3 days to remedy the situation or face daily fines of $200. Frank knew exactly who had filed the complaint. Mercer owned the biggest real estate agency in the county and had been trying to buy up struggling farms for development. Frank had refused his lowball offers 3 times now. Inside the house, Frank sat at the kitchen table, the notice in front of him. The calendar on the wall showed the mortgage due date circled in red. Even if he sold his truck, it wouldn't cover everything. And now this, the walls of problems seemed to be closing in from all sides, leaving no path forward. Frank put his head in his hands, allowing himself a rare moment of despair where no one could see. Clara would have known what to do. She always did. Over the next 2 days, a curious routine developed on the Miller farm. Each morning, Frank would wake before sunrise, start the coffee, and find Jim already in the equipment shed working on the tractor. The veteran moved with purpose, his limp less pronounced as he warmed up with the work. They'd share breakfast in companionable silence, then tackle the day's tasks together. Jim proved himself invaluable. Beyond his mechanical abilities, he knew farming, the rhythms of the land, the language of machinery, the shortcuts that only come from experience. He fixed the water pump that had been giving Frank trouble for months, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, and somehow got the ancient radio in the barn working again. Learn all this in the Marines? Frank asked on the second afternoon, as they repaired a section of roof that had leaked during the last snow. Jim handed him a nail. Some of it. Rest comes from growing up with nothing. You either fix things or you go without. By evening, Frank would check for messages from Michael, while Jim prepared simple but hearty meals. Field cooking was my specialty, he explained, when Frank commented on his surprisingly good stew. Marines eat better when someone knows how to make MREs edible. The code violation notice remained on the kitchen table, a silent reminder of the threat looming over this newfound rhythm. Frank had called the county office, but Howard Mercer was unavailable both times. The property tax bill sat beside it, along with the final notice from the bank. Frank kept these worries to himself. On the morning of the third day, Frank drove into town for supplies, leaving Jim continuing his work on the tractor. Main Street in Riverdale wasn't what it used to be. The hardware store where Frank's father had spent Saturday mornings gossiping with neighbors had been replaced by a dollar store. Whitman's Diner remained, though, a stubborn holdout from better days. Frank stopped for coffee, taking a seat at the counter where Betty Whitman had been, serving locals for 40 years. "The usual, Frank?" she asked, already pouring his black coffee. "Thanks, Betty." She leaned against the counter. "Heard you've got company out at your place." News traveled fast in Riverdale. Frank shouldn't have been surprised. Just helping out. "A fellow veteran for a few days," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "He's headed to Granite City for work." Betty lowered her voice. "Howard Mercer was in here yesterday with some of the council members. They were talking about your apartment, saying it's against code or some nonsense." Frank nodded. "Got the notice." "That man's been trying to get his hands on your land since Clara passed," Betty said, disgust evident in her voice. "It's not about codes. It's about pushing you out." Frank knew she was right. Mercer had approached him at Clara's funeral. Her funeral, with an offer to take the burden of the farm off his hands. The memory still made his jaw clench. "I'm not selling," Frank said simply. Betty patted his hand. "No good? Oh, and take this." She slid a paper bag across the counter. "Leftover pie from yesterday. Would just go to waste otherwise." It wouldn't go to waste, and they both knew it. But Frank accepted the gesture with grace. More charity he couldn't refuse and couldn't return. At the general store, Frank collected the few supplies he could afford. As he was checking out, Howard Mercer entered, his expensive overcoat standing out among the work clothes and winter jackets of the other customers. "Frank." Mercer nodded, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Got my notice, I assume?" "I did," Frank replied, keeping his voice even. "Seems strange to suddenly enforce a code that's been ignored for 30 years. The barn apartment had existed since Frank's father built it for seasonal workers decades ago." Mercer shrugged. "Rules are rules. Council's been lax too long." He lowered his voice. "Though we might be able to work something out, my offer for your property still stands. You'd be free of all this struggle." The last word carried a hint of condescension that made Frank's ears burn. He paid for his groceries and turned to face Mercer directly. "Not interested," he said firmly, "and my guest will be gone in a day or two anyway." "Good to hear," Mercer replied. "Would hate to see those fines start piling up. Times are tough enough for small farmers, aren't they?" The threat wasn't subtle. Frank left without responding, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully in contrast to his mood. When he returned to the farm, Frank found Jim standing beside the tractor, wiping his hands on a rag. The veteran's face broke into a rare grin. "She'll run," Jim announced. "Needed to fabricate a part, but she's purring now." For the first time in months, Frank felt something close to optimism. With the tractor working, he could still plant a winter crop, maybe even catch up on some payments. As they tested the engine, its healthy rumble vibrating through the shed, Frank made a decision. "Jim," he said as they headed back to the house for lunch, "what's waiting for you in Granite City?" The veteran's expression turned guarded. "Just heard they need workers at the factory. Pay any good? Enough to get by." Frank stopped walking, causing Jim to pause and look back. "I've got 80 acres that need working, a tractor that runs, thanks to you, and enough challenges to keep 2 men busy full-time. Could use a farmhand who knows what they're doing." Jim's eyes narrowed slightly. "You can't afford a farmhand." "Can't afford not to have one either," Frank countered. "Place would be worth something if I could get it productive again. I can offer Room and board, plus a share of whatever profit we managed to squeeze out. He didn't mention the zoning notice, the tax bill, or the bank's threats. Those were his problems, not Jim's. The veteran studied Frank's face, then looked out across the snow-covered fields to the faded red barn and the mountains beyond. Something in his expression shifted, a tension releasing. "Been a long time since I stayed in one place," Jim said finally. "Been a long time since I had help," Frank replied. They left it at that, an agreement formed without further words. As they walked back to the farmhouse, Frank felt the weight on his shoulders shift slightly. It wasn't gone, but somehow it seemed more bearable, shared with someone who understood the value of the land beneath their feet and the work it demanded. Neither man noticed the black SUV that drove slowly past the property, the driver taking pictures before continuing down the road. That evening, Frank's phone rang. The caller ID showed Riverdale Town Hall. Frank hesitated before answering, his hand hovering over the receiver as he exchanged glances with Jim, who sat at the kitchen table reviewing seed catalogs. "Miller," Frank answered, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Mr. Miller, this is Diana Lowell from the town council," came a crisp female voice. "There's an emergency council meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. regarding your property's code violations. Your presence is requested." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "Emergency meeting for a barn apartment that's been there 30 years? The council has received multiple complaints about unauthorized residency," Diana replied. "We've also been informed you're operating an unregistered boarding house. It's a farm with a farmhand," Frank said, struggling to keep his voice even, "just like my father had, and his father before him. Nevertheless, your presence is required. 9 a.m. sharp." The line went dead before Frank could respond. He set the phone down slowly, aware of Jim watching him. "Trouble?" the veteran asked quietly. Frank explained the situation, laying out the council meeting and what it likely meant. "They're going to order me to evict you from the barn," he concluded. "Mercer's got most of the council in his pocket. He's been buying up foreclosed farms for years, turning good farmland into vacation properties and strip malls." Jim nodded slowly. "I should move on. Don't want to bring you more problems." "You've fixed my tractor, repaired my roof, and helped me plan a winter crop," Frank countered. "You're not the problem." "Still," Jim said, "sounds like I'm giving them ammunition." Frank stared out the window at the barn, its weathered red paint catching the last light of day. Something his father used to say came back to him. "A man who won't stand for something will fall for anything." "I'll go to their meeting," Frank said finally. "But I'm not kicking you out." Jim studied him. "You sure that's wise? Seems like you're already in a tight spot with the bank." Frank hadn't told Jim about the mortgage situation or the tax bill, but small towns held few secrets. The veteran had probably pieced it together from conversations in town or the pile of final notices Frank had unsuccessfully tried to hide. "Probably not wise," Frank admitted, "but it's right." Later that night, Frank sat alone at the kitchen table, spreading his financial paperwork before him in the pool of light from the overhead lamp. The property tax bill, $3,200 due in 5 days. The mortgage statement, 3 months behind, $4,500, needed to stop foreclosure proceedings. The final notice from the electric company. Clara's medical bills. He could sell the farm to Mercer, pay off the debts, maybe have enough left for a small place in town. That would be the practical choice, the wise choice even. But every time he considered it, he felt Clara's presence, heard the echo of her voice. "This land isn't just dirt and crops, Frank. It's your heritage. It's Michael's birthright." The next morning, Frank rose earlier than usual. He laid out his one good suit, the same dark blue one he'd worn to Clara's funeral, and his polished shoes. Jim found him struggling with the tie. "Let me," the veteran offered, stepping forward to help. His weathered hands worked with surprising dexterity. "Got used to this in the service. Dress uniforms required perfect ties," Frank nodded his thanks, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. It had been Clara who tied his ties before. "You don't have to do this," Jim said quietly. "I can be gone before that meeting starts." Frank shook his head. "That's not who I am." He met Jim's eyes in the mirror. "And it's not who Clara would want me to be." The town hall was unusually crowded for a morning meeting. Word had spread about Frank's situation. Farmers whose families had worked Riverdale soil for generations sat alongside newer residents and business owners. Frank recognized faces he hadn't seen in months, people who'd been too busy surviving to socialize. At the front of the room, the 7 council members sat behind a long table, Howard Mercer at the center. His tailored suit and gold watch stood in stark contrast to the worn clothes of most attendees. This emergency session of the Riverdale Town Council will come to order, announced Diana Lowell, the town clerk. Today, we're addressing code violations at the Miller property, specifically the unauthorized residential use of an agricultural building and operation of an unregistered boarding house. Mercer leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, we've received documentation that you're housing an individual in a structure that doesn't meet residential codes. This poses safety and liability issues for our community." Frank stood, aware of all eyes on him. "That structure is a barn apartment built by my father in 1972. It's housed farmhands for decades without issue. But it hasn't been inspected or certified for residential use," Mercer countered smoothly. "And your guest isn't a registered employee. He's a transient with no known history in this county." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Frank felt heat rising in his face. "Jim Williams is a Marine Corps veteran who served this country for 24 years, Frank said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "He's my farmhand, helping me get my operation back on solid ground." "So you admit you're housing him illegally?" Mercer pressed. "I admit I'm continuing a tradition of community and support that built this town," Frank replied, looking around at the familiar faces. "The same tradition that had neighbors helping with harvests, barn raisings, and hard times. The tradition this council seems determined to regulate out of existence." An older farmer in the back called out, "Hear, hear!" Several others nodded. Mercer's expression hardened. "Traditions don't supersede laws, Mr. Miller. The council has a responsibility to enforce codes that protect our community. Your situation presents multiple violations that carry significant fines, $200 per day, starting today." Frank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He couldn't afford even one day of those fines. "Those fines would force me to sell," Frank said, stating what everyone already knew, which I suspect is the point. "Your financial difficulties aren't the council's concern," Mercer said dismissively. "But I've always said I'd be willing to make a fair offer on your property." Betty Whitman stood up from her seat. "We all know what Howard considers fair, and it's about half of market value. He's been picking off struggling farms like vultures. On roadkill." Several people chuckled, but Mercer remained unruffled. "The matter before us isn't my business practices, but Mr. Miller's code violations." Frank took a deep breath. It was time to lay all his cards on the table. "I'm not evicting Jim Williams," he said clearly. "He's a veteran who served this country while the rest of us enjoyed the freedom he helped protect. He's got skills this farm needs, and I've got space he can use. If that means I have to fight these fines in court, then that's what I'll do." Mrs. Henderson, who sat near the front, spoke up. "Frank Miller has helped every person in this room at some point. Fixed cars, repaired homes, plowed driveways in winter, never asked for a dime. And this is how we repay him?" "The law is the law," Mercer insisted. "The council will now vote on enforcement of daily fines until the violation is remedied." Frank watched, heart sinking, as the vote proceeded. 5-2 in favor of the fines. As expected, Mercer didn't even try to hide his satisfied smile. Enforcement begins immediately, Diana Lowell announced, not meeting Frank's eyes. This meeting is adjourned. As people filed out, some stopped to squeeze Frank's shoulder or whisper words of support. Betty Whitman promised to start a petition. Mrs. Henderson hugged him with tears in her eyes, but good intentions wouldn't pay $200 daily fines or stop the bank from foreclosing. Frank walked alone to his truck, his good suit feeling restrictive and foreign. He had made his stand and lost. But as he climbed into the driver's seat, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. When Frank returned to the farm, Jim was waiting by the porch steps. The veteran's face was hard to read, but his packed duffel bag sitting nearby told Frank everything he needed to know. "I heard," Jim said simply. "Mrs. Henderson called." Frank nodded, not surprised. News traveled at the speed of light in small towns. He climbed out of his truck, loosening his tie with a sigh of relief. "So you know I lost," Frank said, walking toward the porch. "Which is why I should move on," Jim replied, gesturing to his bag. "You've done more than enough, Frank. I won't be the reason you lose your farm." Frank stopped, studying the veteran's face. In just a few days, this man had become more than a stranger he'd helped. Jim had proven himself hard-working, skilled and honest, qualities Frank valued above all others. The kind of man who understood what the land meant, who respected the traditions that had built communities like Riverdale. "The fines start today," Frank acknowledged. $200 a day that I don't have. All the more reason for me to go." "And where will you go?" Frank asked. "Still Granite City?" Jim shrugged, the gesture somehow containing decades of drifting. "Maybe, or south where it's warmer." Frank looked past Jim to the fields beyond the barn. The winter wheat they'd planned to plant would have to wait now. There'd be no crop, no income to forestall the bank. The tractor Jim had fixed would sit idle. "You know," Frank said slowly, "my dad faced something similar back in '85. Drought had wiped out our crop. Bank was breathing down his neck. Town wanted to put a road through our best field." He paused, remembering. "He told me something I never forgot, said, 'The right thing and the easy thing rarely travel the same road.'" Jim remained silent, waiting. "I've already chosen the hard road by refusing to sell to Mercer," Frank continued. "Might as well see it through." He pointed to Jim's duffel. "Put that back in the barn. We've got a tractor that runs and fields that need planting." The veteran didn't move. "You're being fined because of me, Frank. I'm being fined because Howard Mercer wants my land, and I said no," Frank corrected. "You're just the excuse." Jim studied Frank for a long moment. "Even if I stay, how will you fight this?" The council voted. "Don't know yet," Frank admitted. "But I do know that 2 heads are better than 1, and 4 hands get more work done than 2. A rare smile flickered across Jim's face. "Stubborn as a mule, aren't you?" "Family trait," Frank acknowledged with a half-smile of his own. "Now come. On if I'm going down, might as well go down swinging." As they walked toward the house, Betty Whitman's ancient station wagon came rattling up the driveway, followed by 2 more vehicles Frank recognized as belonging to other local business owners. Betty climbed out waving a sheaf of papers. "We're starting a petition," she announced without preamble. "The council can't just change enforcement overnight to push folks out." Behind her, Sam Wilson from the auto shop and Jennifer Lee, who ran the local grocery, nodded in agreement. "We've had barn apartments and farmhands in this county since it was founded," Sam added. "Can't let Mercer rewrite the rules just because he wants to build more vacation homes nobody local can afford." Frank was touched by their support, but shook his head. "Appreciate it, but a petition won't stop the fines, and it won't help with the bank," Jennifer stepped forward. The fines only apply if you're housing someone in an uncertified dwelling, right? What if we help bring the barn apartment up to code? Still needs permits, inspections, Frank pointed out. Could take weeks if they approve it at all. Meanwhile, the fines keep coming. The small group fell silent. The reality of the situation sinking in. Good intentions couldn't overcome bureaucracy designed to work against them. What about your son? Betty asked gently. Could Michael help? Frank's jaw tightened. He's deployed, and I wouldn't ask him to use his combat pay to bail. Out his old man anyway. Jim, who had been quiet during this exchange, cleared his throat. There might be another option. All eyes turned to him. What if I wasn't living in the barn as a tenant or employee, but as a guest of the family? Different code requirements. For guests, Sam said, nodding slowly, especially family guests. But Jim isn't family, Jennifer pointed out. Not by blood, Jim acknowledged, then hesitated before continuing. But I served with a Michael Miller in Afghanistan. Sergeant, Army Rangers, that your son? Frank stared at Jim in disbelief. My Michael's a staff sergeant now. Rangers, yes. Jim nodded. Thought so. Recognized him in the photos. We were at Bagram together in 2019. His unit supported our marine operation. A slight smile crossed Jim's weathered face. Good man. Pulled two of my guys out of a bad situation during a dust storm. Frank felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. You knew my son and didn't say anything? Wasn't sure at first, Jim replied. Lot of Millers in the service. But when I saw his picture and heard his rank, I connected the dots. Didn't want to presume on the connection. Betty clasped her hands together. Don't you see, this changes everything. Jim isn't just some stranger. He served with Frank's son. He's practically family. The council won't care, Frank said, but he felt a flicker of hope nonetheless. They might not, Sam agreed, but the local paper will. Town council fines farmer for housing veteran who served with owner's son. That headline writes itself. Jennifer was already reaching for her phone. My cousin works at the Riverdale Gazette. We need to get this story out before the first fine is officially recorded. By evening, word had spread throughout Riverdale County. The Gazette's editor had promised a front-page story for tomorrow's edition. Several veterans from the local VFW post had called Frank to offer support. Social media posts about the situation were being shared beyond county lines. As darkness fell, Frank and Jim sat on the porch despite the cold, watching car headlights occasionally pass on the distant main road. The petition Betty had started already had over 100 signatures. The community was rallying, but Frank knew Howard Mercer well enough to know he wouldn't back down easily. Thank you, Frank said quietly, for helping Michael. Jim shook his head. No thanks needed. He earned my respect that day. Still, should have told me sooner. Wasn't sure how you'd take it, Jim admitted. Some folks don't like reminders of what their children face overseas. Frank understood that too well. Every news report about Afghanistan or Iraq sent his heart into his throat, wondering if Michael was there, if he was safe. Think this will work? Frank asked after a while. The publicity. Jim considered the question. Depends on how much Mercer cares about public opinion. Men like him usually care about money more than anything. True, Frank agreed, and his real estate business depends on locals using his services. Then we've got a fighting chance, Jim said. But it won't solve the bank problem. Frank nodded. Soberly, even if they overcame the fines, the mortgage payments and tax bill remained. The fundamental problems hadn't changed. As if reading his thoughts, Jim spoke again. One battle at a time, Frank. That's how you survive a war. Frank looked at the veteran. This man who had served with his son, who had helped him when he needed it most, who understood the value of the land beneath their feet. Maybe together they could find a way forward, even if the path wasn't yet clear. Inside the house, the phone rang. Frank rose to answer it, wondering what new challenge awaited. Hello? Mister? Miller, an unfamiliar female voice. My name is Captain Rebecca Martinez. I understand you're housing James Williams, a veteran who served with your son. Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. Yes, that's right. I'm calling from Fort Carson, she continued. Your situation has come to our attention through some of our personnel. We'd like to help if possible. Frank listened, hope and wariness battling within him. When he hung up the phone several minutes later, he returned to the porch with a stunned expression. What is it? Jim asked, immediately alert. Bad news? Not bad, Frank said slowly. Just unexpected. That was the Army. They want to send people to talk to us tomorrow. About you, the farm, everything. Jim's eyebrows rose. The Army? Why would they care about a zoning dispute? Captain Martinez said something about community relations and veteran support initiatives. Wouldn't give details over the phone. Both men fell silent, contemplating this new development. Neither knew what to expect, but something had shifted. The lonely stand Frank had taken that morning had somehow reached beyond Riverdale, beyond what either of them could have anticipated. As they headed inside against the growing cold, Frank noticed Jim pause to look up at the night sky, the stars brilliant above the dark countryside. Something wrong? Frank asked. Jim shook his head slightly, just thinking how strange life's paths can be. Week ago, I was sleeping rough in freezing temperatures, heading nowhere in particular. He turned to Frank. Never expected to find myself in the middle of a small-town battle. Regret it? Frank asked. Jim considered the question, then answered simply, no. That single word carried more weight than a lengthy explanation could have. Frank understood. Sometimes the hardest roads led exactly where you needed to go, even if you couldn't see the destination when you started the journey. Frank woke to the sound of vehicles on his gravel driveway. The bedside clock read 6:17 a.m., still dark outside in the January morning. He found Jim already at the front window, peering through the curtains. 4 cars, Jim reported, his voice tense. Black SUV in front, Mercer's with them. A heavy knock rattled the front door. Frank opened it to find Sheriff Collins and Howard Mercer, with 2 deputies and a county clerk behind them. Frank Miller, Sheriff Collins said formally, discomfort evident in his expression. I have an emergency injunction ordering the immediate evacuation of all unauthorized dwellings on your property. He held out an official document bearing the county seal. Frank took it, snow blowing in through the open door. An injunction? At 6 in the morning during a snowstorm? Frank asked incredulously. Mercer stepped forward, satisfaction evident beneath his show of concern. The council held an emergency session last night after receiving evidence that your situation presents an immediate public safety hazard. Sheriff Collins avoided looking directly at either man. I'm authorized to ensure Mr. Williams vacates the premises immediately. The fines will continue to accrue until inspection confirms compliance. It's 15 degrees out there with a storm getting worse by the minute, Frank protested. You're going to force a veteran out into this? The county clerk stepped forward with another document. Mr. Miller, I'm also required to serve you with this notice of accumulated fines. The current amount stands at $400, with an additional $200 to be added daily. Frank took the paper, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. $400 he didn't have, with no end in sight. You have 1 hour to comply, Sheriff Collins said before returning to his vehicle. As the others followed, Mercer lingered behind. This could all go away, Frank. My offer still stands, slightly reduced, of course, given the complications. Frank's hands clenched. Get off my property, Howard. Mercer's smile tightened. 1 hour, then your friend is trespassing and things get much more complicated. He nodded toward the fine notice. With what you already owe the bank, how long do you think you can hold out? After Mercer left, Frank made a desperate decision. 30 minutes later, he drove his pickup down his driveway with Jim beside him, visibility reduced by the swirling snow. He told the sheriff they were heading to the bus station, but instead drove to Mrs. Henderson's farm and her late husband's hunting cabin. "Won't the sheriff check here?" Jim asked as they hurried into the small cabin. "Eventually, maybe. But in this storm, nobody's going anywhere for a day or two. Buys us time." By afternoon, the storm had intensified to near blizzard conditions. Frank's phone rang, Mrs. Henderson reporting that the sheriff had checked her house but hadn't ventured to the cabin. She'd also learned that the fine now totaled $600. $600 I don't have, Frank said after hanging up. "And that's just the beginning." He pulled out the final notice from the bank. "I need at least $4,000 by Friday to stop the foreclosure, plus another $3,000 for property taxes." The reality hung heavy in the small cabin. Even if they resolved the zoning issue, the financial hole was too deep. "I've spent 30 years working that land," Frank said quietly. "My grandfather cleared those fields by hand. My father built that barn." His voice caught. "Now it'll probably become vacation homes for rich people from the city." As darkness fell, Frank stepped outside for more firewood. The storm had transformed the world into a swirling white void. Standing there, snow collecting on his shoulders, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He'd likely lose the farm regardless, but couldn't bring himself to regret helping Jim. Some principles were worth holding on to, even when they cost everything. When he returned, Jim was at the window, staring intently into the storm. "What is it?" Frank asked. "Lights through the trees," Jim replied. "Multiple vehicles." Both men listened as engine sounds became audible over the howling wind. Headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the trees around the cabin. Not one vehicle, but several, making their way steadily toward them. Frank and Jim exchanged a look of apprehension. They were trapped, with nowhere to go in the blizzard. All they could do was wait, as the vehicles converged on the small cabin in the woods. Frank grabbed his shotgun from beside the door, not to threaten, but from a lifetime of rural caution. Jim positioned himself at the window, his military training evident in his stance. "How many?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "At least 3 vehicles," Jim replied. "Maybe more behind them." The approaching headlights cut through the blizzard, creating ghostly patterns on the cabin walls. Frank felt a peculiar calm settle over him. After days of mounting pressure, there was an odd relief in finally reaching the breaking point. No more decisions to make, no more options to weigh. "Could be Mercer with the sheriff," Frank said. "Found us faster than I expected." Jim shook his head. "Formation's wrong. Sheriff would come with 1, maybe 2 vehicles." The lead vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. Others pulled alongside, creating a half-circle of headlights. Frank counted 5 sets now, doors opening as dark figures emerged into the storm. "Whatever happens," Frank said quietly, "I want you to know I don't regret helping you." Jim looked at him, surprise flashing across his weathered face. "Most people would. I'm not most people." Frank set the shotgun down and moved toward the door. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Before he could reach for the handle, a firm knock sounded. Frank exchanged one last look with Jim, then opened the door. Standing on the threshold, uniform dusted with snow, was a woman in her 30s, wearing an army captain's insignia. Behind her, partially obscured by swirling snow, stood several military personnel. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice crisp despite the howling wind. "I'm Captain Rebecca Martinez. We spoke on the phone." Frank stared in disbelief. "You drove through this storm?" "We started before it got bad," she replied. "May we come in?" Frank stepped aside, and Captain Martinez entered, followed by 4 soldiers. They stamped snow from their boots while casting curious glances around the small cabin. "Master Sergeant Williams." Captain Martinez nodded to Jim, who straightened automatically. "Been looking for you." Jim's expression revealed nothing. "Captain, Frank felt lost, sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. "You know each other?" "Not personally," Captain Martinez replied, removing her gloves. "But Sergeant Williams' reputation precedes him. 24 years of distinguished service, 3 Purple Hearts, and the Silver Star." Frank looked at Jim in surprise. The veteran had mentioned his service, but nothing about medals or recognition. "That's why we're here," Captain Martinez continued. "When we heard about your situation, Mr. Miller—" "How did you hear about it?" Frank interrupted. "Your son," she answered simply. Staff Sergeant Miller contacted his commanding officer when he learned what was happening through Mrs. Henderson's email. Given Sergeant Williams' service record and your son's standing, it got attention. Frank hadn't known Mrs. Henderson was in touch with Michael. The thought of his son reaching out to help from halfway around the world made his throat tighten. "What happens now?" Frank asked, acutely aware that the fines were still accumulating and the bank's deadline loomed regardless of who stood in his cabin. Captain Martinez glanced at the other soldiers. "That depends on several things, including what Sergeant Williams wants." All eyes turned to Jim, who looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Just wanted some peace," he said quietly. "Found it here for a little while at least." "The Army takes care of its own," Captain Martinez said. "And while technically you're a Marine, today we're all on the same team." She turned back to Frank. "We'd like to propose a solution, Mr. Miller." Frank felt the weight of the past days, the confrontations, the fines, the looming loss of his family legacy pressing down on him. He was a proud man who'd never asked for help, who'd faced every challenge alone since Clara died. But standing in this borrowed cabin, with his farm slipping away and a storm raging outside, he recognized that sometimes strength meant accepting. "The hand extended toward you." "I'm listening," he said simply. Outside, the headlights remained steady in the darkness, a circle of light in the heart of the storm. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that glittered in the morning light. Frank stood on the cabin porch, coffee mug warming his hands as he watched the soldiers clearing paths between their vehicles. Captain Martinez's proposal had been straightforward but unexpected. The Army was conducting winter training exercises at Fort Carson. They needed temporary land use for a rural community outreach program, part of a new veteran reintegration initiative. Frank's farm, with its varied terrain and location, was ideal. They would pay a fair rental fee up front and handle all accommodations. "You're saying the Army wants to rent my farm?" Frank had asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "For 3 months initially," Captain Martinez had confirmed, "with option to extend. We've been looking for suitable locations for this pilot program." The paperwork she'd produced was official, complete with Department of Defense letterhead. The rental amount, $15,000 for the first quarter, was enough to cover Frank's mortgage arrears, property taxes, and the accumulated fines. Now, as Frank watched the soldiers efficiently organizing equipment despite the deep snow, Jim joined him on the porch. "You know this isn't really about their outreach program," Jim said quietly. Frank nodded. "Figured as much. Michael pulled some strings. Your son is well respected," Jim replied, "but even he couldn't authorize this kind of operation without a legitimate purpose." He gestured toward the soldiers. "That's real training happening there. The program is genuine. Just convenient timing," Frank observed. "Military excels at finding solutions that serve multiple purposes." They watched in silence as Captain Martinez approached, crunching through the snow. "We have a convoy arriving at your farm in 1 hour, Mr. Miller," she reported. "Advance team is already clearing your driveway. We'll need you there to sign for equipment delivery." Frank was still processing how quickly everything was happening. "What about the town council? The zoning violations?" Captain Martinez smiled slightly. "Already handled. The Department of Defense has certain jurisdictional privileges when conducting official operations. Your barn apartment has been temporarily designated as military support housing for our on-site coordinator. She nodded toward Jim. "Me?" Jim asked, surprised. "Who better than a decorated Marine with extensive field experience?" she replied. "Unless you have other plans." The look that passed between them suggested this had been arranged well before last night. In that moment, Frank understood that forces far larger than Howard Mercer and the Riverdale Town Council had been set in motion. His small act of kindness toward a homeless veteran had somehow connected to something much bigger. 30 minutes later, they were in a military vehicle heading back to Frank's farm. As they turned onto his long driveway, Frank stared in disbelief. A line of military vehicles stretched almost a quarter-mile down the county road. Trucks, Humvees, even what looked like mobile command units. At the house, soldiers were efficiently unloading equipment. Some were setting up weatherproof tents. In the field beyond the barn, others were running communication lines. The farm had transformed into a hive of organized activity. Sheriff Collins' cruiser was parked uncertainly at the edge of the property, the sheriff himself watching the proceedings with evident confusion. When he spotted Frank, he approached. Incautiously, "Frank, what's going on here?" he asked, eyeing the soldiers. "Mercer's blowing up my phone about trespassing charges." Captain Martinez intercepted him, presenting official documentation. "Sheriff Collins, I believe this addresses any concerns about jurisdiction or property use." As the sheriff reviewed the papers, his eyebrows rose steadily. "This is federal authorization?" "Yes. The Miller Farm is now the site of a Department of Defense community outreach and training facility, effective immediately for a minimum of 90 days. The sheriff handed back the documents, clearly relieved to have the situation taken out of his hands. "I'll inform the council." As he left, Frank spotted Howard Mercer's SUV approaching slowly. The realtor parked at the edge of the property, watching the military operation with barely concealed fury. "Should I be concerned about him?" Captain Martinez asked, following Frank's gaze. "Not anymore," Frank replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in days. "Not anymore." By mid-afternoon, Frank's farm had become an organized military operation. Soldiers had established a perimeter, set up communications equipment, and erected several large weatherproof tents in the field beyond the barn. The activity drew curious onlookers from town who parked along the county road, watching the proceedings with a mixture of confusion and fascination. Frank sat at his kitchen table with Captain Martinez and Jim, reviewing the rental agreement. The kitchen felt warmer than it had in weeks. The soldiers had fixed his furnace as one of their first tasks. "So the program actually starts next week," Captain Martinez explained. "We'll be bringing in veterans from around the state for agricultural training, rural skills development, and community integration workshops." "And this was planned before my situation?" Frank asked, still struggling to believe the timing. Captain Martinez and Jim exchanged a glance before she answered. "The program was in development for months. We needed a location. Your son's alert about your situation just accelerated our timeline." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young soldier entered, saluting Captain Martinez. "Ma'am, there's a town council delegation requesting to speak with Mr. Miller." Frank looked out the window to see Howard Mercer standing beside his SUV, flanked by 2 council members and the county clerk. Their body language suggested frustration, arms crossed, expressions tight. "I'll handle this," Captain Martinez said, rising from her seat. "No," Frank replied, standing up. "This is still my farm. I should face them." Outside, Mercer's usual composure had cracked. "This is irregularly, possibly illegally acquired federal intervention," he was saying to a soldier, who looked thoroughly unimpressed. When Mercer spotted Frank, he strode forward. "What kind of stunt are you pulling, Miller? You can't just bring in the military to override local jurisdiction." Frank was about to respond when Betty Whitman's station wagon pulled up, followed by several other vehicles from town. Betty emerged, carrying a large folder, her expression triumphant. "Perfect timing," she announced, approaching the group. "Frank, I've been at the county records office all morning. You'll want to hear this." She nodded curtly at Mercer. "You too, Howard." "This isn't the time for—" Mercer began, but Betty cut him off. "This is exactly the time," she insisted, opening her folder. "I found the original zoning documents for Riverdale County from 1952. They explicitly allow for accessory dwelling units on agricultural properties for the purpose of housing farm laborers and extended family." She extracted a photocopy, holding it up. "Never repealed, never amended." Mercer's face flushed. "That's an outdated provision. Still on the books," Betty countered. "And there's more. The code violation notice you issued requires a prior property inspection, which never occurred. And the emergency session where you pushed through the injunction violated 3 separate open meeting laws." The council members shifted uncomfortably, looking at Mercer with new wariness. One of them, an older man who owned the local pharmacy, stepped forward. "Howard, you assured us this was all properly vetted." "It was a public safety issue," Mercer insisted. "The barn apartment isn't up to code." "Actually," Captain Martinez interjected, producing a document from her pocket, "our engineers conducted a safety inspection this morning. The structure exceeds minimum requirements for residential use." Frank stared at Mercer as understanding dawned. "This was never about codes or safety," he said quietly. "You've been trying to force me into selling by any means necessary." "That's ridiculous," Mercer scoffed, but his expression betrayed him. The pharmacy owner turned to Frank. "Is that true, Howard? Have you been targeting Frank specifically?" Before Mercer could answer, several more townspeople arrived, including Mrs. Henderson and Sam from the auto shop. The small crowd had grown to nearly 30 people. Mrs. Henderson approached Frank. "We've been talking," she said, gesturing to the gathered residents, "about what's been happening to the farms around here, about how many have been sold to Mercer's development company." She handed Frank a newspaper clipping. "This might explain why. It was a business announcement from a regional paper dated 2 weeks earlier. Riverdale Gateway Development secures major funding for resort project." The article detailed plans for a luxury resort complex, contingent on acquiring several key properties, including Frank's farm, which sat at the center of the proposed development. Frank looked up from the article to find Mercer glaring at him, the man's carefully constructed facade now completely shattered. "You needed my land," Frank said, the pieces finally fitting together. "That's why the sudden enforcement, the emergency sessions, the pressure tactics." In that moment, with his neighbors gathered around him and the truth finally exposed, Frank understood that his stand hadn't just been about helping one veteran. It had unwittingly become a stand for his entire community against the forces trying to dismantle their way of life. The next 3 days brought changes to Frank's farm that he could scarcely have imagined a week earlier. The military presence continued to grow, with equipment and personnel transforming his struggling property into a hive of purposeful activity. Tuesday morning found Frank at the county courthouse with Betty and several other townspeople. The emergency council meeting had been called specifically to address the situation at the Miller farm. The council hereby rescinds all violation notices and associated fines against the Miller property, Diana Lowell announced, reading from an official statement. In light of documentation proving the legality of accessory dwellings on agricultural properties and concerns about procedural irregularities in the enforcement actions. Howard Mercer sat stone-faced at the end of the council table, isolated from his former allies who now maintained a careful distance. The other council members had quickly distanced themselves once the true motivation behind his actions became public. As Frank left the courthouse, neighbors and townspeople stopped to shake his hand or offer words of support. News of Mercer's development plans had spread quickly, along with Frank's stand against selling. "Frank!" Mrs. Henderson called, hurrying across the courthouse lawn. "The VFW just called a special meeting. They want to support the veteran program on your farm. Donations, volunteers, everything." By Thursday, Frank had deposited the Army's rental check and paid his mortgage arrears and property taxes. For the first time in months, the weight of immediate financial disaster had lifted from his shoulders. Captain Martinez had arranged for a local contractor to properly update the barn apartment's electrical system, making it undeniably up to code. That afternoon, Frank and Jim stood watching as soldiers constructed an impressive greenhouse behind the barn, part of the agricultural training facility for veterans. "Never thought I'd see something like this on my land," Frank remarked. Jim nodded. "Amazing what can happen when people work together." "Mr. Miller." A young soldier approached, holding a satellite phone. "Call for you, sir." "It's patched through." "From overseas?" Frank took the phone with surprise. "Hello? Dad?" Michael's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakable, filled Frank's ear. "Michael, how are you? Are you safe?" The familiar rush of questions whenever he heard his son's voice. "I'm fine, Dad. Captain Martinez got word to me about what's happening there. Is it true that Master Sergeant Williams is staying with you?" Frank glanced at Jim, who was tactfully moving away to give him privacy. "Yes, he's here. Been a godsend, actually. He saved my life in Bagram, Dad. We were pinned down during a sandstorm. He led a team to extract us when no one else would risk it." Michael's voice grew serious. "If you'd seen what I've seen him do, you'd understand why so many people stepped up when they heard he needed help." Frank watched Jim directing soldiers on the greenhouse construction, showing the same quiet competence he'd brought to fixing the tractor. "He didn't tell me about any of that." "He wouldn't," Michael replied. "Men like him never do." After the call ended, Frank found Jim inspecting the newly repaired barn roof. "My son says you saved his life in Afghanistan," Frank said without preamble. Jim looked uncomfortable. "Your son is a good soldier. Would have done the same for me." "Thank you," Frank said simply. The words seemed inadequate for what he felt. Jim nodded, accepting what wasn't said between them. By Friday, the transformation was impossible to ignore. The farm that had been on the verge of foreclosure now hummed with purpose. Local businesses had begun supplying the military operation, bringing much-needed commerce to town. The VFW had organized a welcome committee for the incoming veteran trainees. Frank's property was becoming a center of community renewal rather than another victim of development. That evening, Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset paint his fields in gold. Betty Whitman pulled up in her station wagon, excitement evident on her face as she hurried over. "Frank, you won't believe this," she said, brandishing a newspaper. 3 other farmers who sold to Mercer are contesting their sales, claiming predatory practices, and the county's launching an investigation into the council's zoning enforcement patterns. Frank took the paper, scanning the headline. Riverdale, farmers fight back, development plans stalled amid investigation. "Your stand started something," Betty said, sitting beside him on the porch. "People are remembering what community really means." As dusk settled over the farm, Frank watched Jim walking from the barn to the house, his limp barely noticeable now. A simple act of kindness had rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted, transforming not just his own circumstances, but touching the entire community. Sometimes, Frank reflected, doing the right thing was its own reward. But sometimes, if you were lucky, you got to see that reward multiplied beyond measure. 3 months later, a crisp spring morning found Frank and Jim standing at the edge of a newly planted field. 50 veterans in formation lined the farm's long driveway, their presence a stark contrast to the 50 soldiers who had arrived during that winter snowstorm. These men and women, some bearing visible wounds, others carrying scars only they could see, had spent the past 12 weeks learning sustainable farming practices, rural skills, and community integration. Today was their graduation from the program. Never thought I'd see something like this here, Frank said, echoing words he'd spoken months earlier, but now with wonder rather than disbelief. Jim nodded, his eyes on the veterans. Every one of them has a story like mine. Searching for purpose, for peace. Did you find it? Frank asked. Peace. The veteran considered the question, looking across the farm that had transformed from a struggling operation to a thriving center of community. The barn gleamed with fresh red paint, the fields were planted with promising crops, and the greenhouse bustled with activity. Found something better, Jim finally answered. Found a mission worth the peace I gave up. Captain Martinez approached, clipboard in hand. We've received approval for program extension, gentlemen. Another 6 months with increased funding. And she walked away. Frank turned to Jim. Will you stay on as coordinator? If you'll have me, Jim replied. Still some work to do here. They both knew he wasn't just talking about the farm. As the graduation ceremony began, Frank watched the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to celebrate. Mrs. Henderson, Betty Whitman, even some former council members. The barriers that had once divided them had given way to a renewed sense of purpose and community. Frank thought about that cold January morning when he'd found a stranger huddled against his barn. One simple choice, to see a fellow human being rather than an intruder, had set everything else in motion. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the most unexpected consequences. Sometimes they change not just a life, but an entire community. And sometimes they bring 50 soldiers to your door at sunrise, not as harbingers of trouble, but as bearers of hope and renewal. Thank you for watching this edition of Inspiring Stories. If this touched your heart, please share how kindness has transformed your life in the comments below.